the leadership in Tehran at the present time will be much more circumspect about acting with a Trump administration in place rather than the Biden administration. I don't think for a moment that any American government is going to say to Israel, you have a completely free hand to do whatever you want, given the potential to drag the United States into some regional conflict. But I think that America itself, and certainly given President Trump's previous record in his dealings with Tehran, are likely to be much more forceful than we've seen in recent times.
A senior advisor to Donald Trump, Brian Lanza, has said the incoming administration will focus on achieving peace in the war in Ukraine rather than winning back territory, which essentially means the return of Crimea, which was annexed by Russia, needs to be off the table. All this follows a call between Trump and President Zelensky yesterday, on which they were reportedly joined by Elon Musk. Zelensky said that although his conversation with Trump had been positive, he cannot yet know what his actions will be. Well, lots to discuss then with my next guest, Sir Liam Fox, a former Defence Secretary. Good afternoon to you, Liam.
Good afternoon, Carol.
What do you make of what Donald Trump has said about Ukraine and what we are hearing? There's been discussion of a buffer zone, discussion of the fact that Ukraine will have to give up territory. Do you think he is going to try to impose some kind of settlement on the Ukrainians?
Well, first of all, I think that the reaction to the Trump election is quite extraordinary. I mean, we've got the Guardian staff are still receiving counselling, and rather than showing respect to the American people for the democratic decision, the metropolitan media are all now telling us that we're at the beginning of a great dark global era. So I think we have to wait and see what happens. It's more than 10 weeks until the new administration will take over. We don't know what policies will be proposed. We don't know who the Secretary of State will be. We don't know who the Defense Secretary will be. So all this supposition about what might happen, I think it is pure conjecture, and it's not a very helpful conjecture either. I think we need to look at some of the realities of that relationship between Putin and the United States. Putin invaded Georgia in 2008 under a Democratic administration. Putin invaded Crimea in 2014 under a Democratic administration, and he invaded Ukraine under a Democratic administration. Now, what is missing here is that Putin has not acted when he has thought that there was a strong Republican administration in office. So I think we need to counterbalance some of these more hysterical views with how Putin has actually behaved.
But we know that the United States at the moment provides such a huge proportion of the Western support for Ukraine in terms of the military equipment, the hardware, the financial commitment. And we know that Donald Trump has signalled that he doesn't necessarily want to carry on doing that, and he wants the rest of NATO to take up some of that commitment. Do you think that he is going to introduce some kind of conditionality to US support, perhaps saying, look, we'll carry on supporting you, but only if you enter properly into peace talks?
Well, he's a deal maker, isn't he, Donald Trump? And I can imagine that any ultimatum or any threat that he might make to the Ukrainians would be bound to be met by one that he'd be making to Russia as well. If Russia were to destroy any hope of peace talks, he may well decide that the Ukrainians could fire American weapons, for example, into Russia. So I think trying to guess what the deal making might be, I think is a bit spurious at the moment. So you can pretty much say anything might be on the table or anything might be off the table. What we know is that America doesn't want to continue to shoulder a disproportionate amount of the burden or even the large financial burden they've had. But they've got to balance that against the geopolitical consequences if Putin is allowed to run riot. Where comes next? The Baltic states. America would certainly be drawn into any conflict there under Article 5 in NATO.
Do you think that the British government should be working to try to persuade the incoming Trump administration of the importance of supporting Ukraine? Clearly, Keir Starmer has been scrambling to try to make up ground after the past comments, not just from David Lammy, who's now the Foreign Secretary, but other senior figures in his team. But do you think that his starting point should be to try to say to the incoming president that it's in America's interests to prevent President Putin prevailing in Ukraine?
Well, of course he should, but then the current Foreign Office and current foreign policy under the current government doesn't show, it doesn't give me any grounds for confidence whatsoever. One of their first acts was to give away effectively the Chagos Islands and allow increased Chinese influence. That's hardly likely to endear them to an incoming Trump administration. Never mind the less important things about what second-rate politicians have been saying about Donald Trump, and they should have known better. But I think that it's in everybody's interest to ensure that NATO stands shoulder to shoulder, including the United Kingdom, including the United States, that we cannot tolerate the complete smashing of international law by military action, and that what Putin has done is completely illegal and completely unacceptable. That has to be the basis from which any British Prime Minister worth his salt bases his position in discussions with the United States.
Do you think, though, that Donald Trump will increase the pressure on the UK and on other NATO allies to significantly ramp up their defence spending? Now, we've heard from Keir Starmer, from John Healey, the Defence Secretary, that they do plan to get up to 2.5%, but we haven't got a date on when that is going to happen. Is there inevitably going to be pressure on Britain and other NATO allies to shoulder a greater burden?
Utterly inevitably. Why should the defence of Europe be carried by the American taxpayers? This has been a question that's been very pertinent for some time. When I was Defence Secretary, along with Robert Gates, who was the American Defence Secretary, we constantly made the point to NATO allies that if they keep expecting the American taxpayers to carry the burden of the defence of Europe, sooner or later, they will reach a point where the American taxpayers' patience runs out. And we've got to be very careful. It's not just also about the amount of money we spend. Incidentally, I think 2.5% of GDP is too low. We have no peace dividend any longer. We live in a very, very dangerous environment with Russia, with Iran's aggression, and with the rumblings of China behind all of that. We need to spend what we need to spend on defense. It's not discretionary spending. The first duty of the government is to keep the country and its people safe. Our government has generally followed the responsibilities that we are meant to have under NATO, but there are still a very large number of our European allies in NATO who don't do that. And as well as spending the money, it has to be spent on the right things. It has to be on the correct military capabilities. And even more than that, there has to be a willingness to deploy.
Well, what about that idea that we've been hearing?
There's no point in having the equipment if you're not willing to use it.
What about that idea that we've been hearing from the incoming Trump team, that what they would like to see is some sort of buffer zone around the current front lines in Ukraine, which of course would freeze the conflict where it is now, and that NATO allies such as Britain, France and Germany, but not the US, should get involved to patrol that? I mean, is there any way that a British government or other European governments would go along with that?
Well, I don't see that as being acceptable to the Ukrainian government. And they're the ones who are the prime movers in this. It is their country that's been invaded. It's their people who are effectively being held hostage by the Russians, and even worse, potentially, the North Koreans at the present time. So there is a limit to what President Zelensky and his government can agree to. And I think that it's not just a matter of what the United States wants. It's also a matter of what the rest of NATO thinks, and more importantly, what the Zelensky government thinks.
Let me just ask you about the Middle East, because we've been hearing reports, they're not yet confirmed, that the Qatari government may be pulling out of its role as a mediator in the talks between Israel and Hamas, essentially because it feels that neither side is properly engaging in the process. Although those talks don't seem to have yielded much in terms of results recently, it's surely a pretty concerning move if indeed Qatar, which it does seem at the moment to be the one nation that is able to bring the two sides together, is no longer prepared to do that.
Well, we had reports yesterday that the Qatari government were saying to Hamas, you are not welcome here. So we might be seeing a shift in that position, but as you say, it remains unclear. The talks that have been there have not produced anything because Iran doesn't want it to happen. Iran, you have to remember, does not want a two-state solution. because Iran does not want Israel to exist as a state. And so the huge damage inflicted on Hezbollah by Israel, the fact that Hamas have been, to all intents and purposes, destroyed militarily in Gaza. Qatar may, it's pure speculation on my part, but they may be reconsidering where they are vis-a-vis Hamas because of the way that Iran has been behaving in recent times.
And if you add into this complex picture the fact that there's now this alleged plot to assassinate Donald Trump by the Iranians in retaliation for the killing of one of their most senior commanders, do you think that there is a sense in which an incoming Trump presidency will initially say to President Netanyahu that he essentially has a free rein to continue with his military solutions to the wars that it's confronting, not just against Hamas in Gaza, but against Hezbollah in Lebanon, and of course against Iran itself? President Biden has been consistently urging Netanyahu to show restraint, not that Netanyahu has necessarily been listening. Will there be a very different signal, do you think, coming from a Trump White House?
I think there'll be a different interpretation in Tehran, because I think that the leadership in Tehran at the present time will be much more circumspect about acting with a Trump administration in place rather than the Biden administration. I don't think for a moment that any American government is going to say to Israel, you have a completely free hand to do whatever you want, given the potential to drag the United States into some regional conflict. But I think that America itself, and certainly given President Trump's previous record in his dealings with Tehran, are likely to be much more forceful than we've seen in recent times.
Sir Liam Fox, former Defence Secretary, really good to speak to you. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Carol.